I'm going to step away for a second and get a drink of water, guys.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, how we doing?
Good. Good.
So Claudia, I can't believe this, it's been a year, huh? Um, you've had almost a year now on Zoom. How are you guys liking it? Are you liking it a bit better than Blackboard?
Yes, it's much more stable. It's more robust. There is some nuances that are a little annoying. um, so, like if you have multiple people that you're using to host a session, you would
Yes.
assume everyone that has the host level can do the same thing and access the same menus, and you cannot.
Yeah, you still have to kind of make co-hosts and yeah, we're still like it's not always clear why that occurs. Like you
Yeah,
should be able to have the privileges, but I don't know. I haven't had enough time yet to do reading further into that or why that occurs.
that's the functionality of it. Hmm. That is it. So, but other than that, it's really good. It's and they're very proactive with like some of the accessibility features. So, like the subtitle captioning, they upgraded that where the person can drag the subtitle captions anywhere on their screen and move it.
Yeah, I
You
noticed
know,
that a couple of weeks ago. That's really cool.
right. So they do make changes. They do listen to the feedback and try to make changes. So they're pretty good on that. I'm gonna go ahead and get started with these intro slides. And then as I told George, once I finish these Zoom intro slides, I'll stop sharing and then you guys can share the PowerPoint.
All right, George, you ready?
All right, so Captioner, you ready? We're going to start at this time.
I am.
Okay, great. Welcome everyone to the accessibility, excuse me. Welcome to the ADA Legal webinar series. I don't know where I'm at, sorry. Which program I'm in. Um, Today's session is the future of accessibility. Sorry about that. A legal perspective, the future is accessible. A legal perspective. Today is our topic on the legal webinar series. My name is Claudia Diaz. I'm Associate Director of the Great Lakes ADA Center, and I'll be working with Marissa Demaya from the Southwest ADA Center to moderate today's session. We're scheduled to start at the top of the hour in about 10 minutes, but I want to get you familiar with the Zoom feature so that at the top of the hour, you can customize all your settings and just be ready to appreciate the presentation. So I'm going to move on to slide number 2. I want to remind participants that you need to be signed into Zoom using your full name. We will use that name to match the name on the registration to issue certificates for participating. If you didn't do that, go ahead and log out, log back in. When you click on the Zoom link, it should have asked your email and your name. You can correct it there, or you can correct it in your Zoom profile. If for some reason you cannot, you can put your comments in the Q&A and say you're verifying how your name appears, and then we'll work with you to make sure your name is correct so that you're able to get a certificate for participating in today's session. Moving on to slide number 3, the Zoom interface appears on the center of your screen. On the bottom left are the audio settings, and in the bottom center, we have 4 icons. First one is a chat icon, which you can use to put comments like, I'm looking for a copy of the handouts, or I need help with my volume, or any of those kind of issues. The Q&A is the box that we ask that you put questions regarding today's topic for our presenter. And the last icon is the CC icon for captioning. And then on the bottom right is the leave icon that you'll use at the end of the session to exit the webinar. And in the upper right-hand corner is the enter full screen icon that you'll use to enlarge the viewing area. Moving on to slide number 4, listening to the webinar via your computer. If you want to adjust your sound, Zoom has its own control for volume. So even if you use your system overall volume control, it will not make a difference to Zoom. You have to use the actual slider bar in Zoom. That is the audio setting located in the bottom left. Once you click on the arrow expand the menu, you'll see the last option says audio settings. Click on that, and then you'll see the slider bar for your speaker icon, and you can adjust your sound there. Participants are muted and you're in listen only mode, so you do not have access to a microphone. Again, any questions or problems you have, put them in the chat and we'll help you, or questions regarding today's topic, put them in the Q&A, please. In the future, if you want to use a mobile device, you can download the Zoom mobile app for free. It is compatible with the Apple devices, iOS system, iPad, iPhones, and Android devices. You would just download the Zoom Cloud Meeting app. It is free. Or you can participate using the browser on your mobile device. Slide number 6, if you are not able to participate on your computer and need to listen on your phone, we did provide the call-in number. In the email reminder that was sent out yesterday, we also posted in your account. So if you go to the ada-legal.org website. Log into your account. You'll see today's session is listed in your upcoming sessions, and click on it. We put a copy of the agenda up there. We put the phone number information to call in, and we also put the stream text option as well as the Zoom link. So it's all posted in your account if you need those options. We are offering real-time captioning for today's session. We have two methods you can use captioning in Zoom or stream text. If you choose to do stream text, just keep in mind that it will require a second browser for you to follow the live captions. Stream text does allow you to customize your view, the background color, font size, font type. Zoom has the built-in subtitle feature, which lets you move the captions that appear in the bottom subtitles around your screen, or you can do full transcript version, which will be also available in Zoom, and it will allow you to save a copy of the entire transcript at the end of the webinar. Slide number 8, if you are submitting questions, there, please use the Q&A box. You'll notice when you type your question in the box, there is a checkbox at the bottom to send anonymous. So if you do not want your name to appear, just click that before you click on send. Do not put your questions regarding today's topic in the chat box. The moderators will not be monitoring the chat box for questions regarding today's topic. So please put them all in the Q&A box. And then we just ask that people refrain from any side conversations or other commentary in the chat box so that it doesn't cause distraction to other participants in the room. If you are on the telephone, you can send your questions via email to webinars@adaconferences.org, and I will make sure they are included during the Q&A segment. We are recording today's session. We will post the archive on our website tomorrow on the ada-legal.org website. The archive recording will include a copy of the PowerPoint as well. If you're still having problems with the Zoom features, go ahead and put them in the chat and I'll help you. Or you can send an email to webinars@adaconferences.org. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and invite the presenters to share the PowerPoint for today's session.
All right. Hi, everyone. This is Marissa DeMaya. While George gets that going, I will go ahead and get started here.
All right,
Again,
let me hit record. 1 second. We
oh
have
yeah.
actually we got 2 minutes before the top of the hour
Oh,
here.
we do.
So let's let people
Thank you.
get connected and situated with those features I just reviewed.
I think my mind is on spring break. Everyone, forgive me.
Okay, welcome everyone to the ADA Legal Webinar Series. Today's session is The Future is Accessible, a Legal Perspective. I would like to introduce Marissa DeMaya from the Southwest ADA Center. Marissa, you have the microphone.
Hi. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Claudia. Good afternoon. Again, my name is Marissa DeMaya, and I'm with the Southwest ADA Center. I will be serving as moderator for today and assisting, along with Claudia, our presenters, with our presenter, excuse me, with slides and questions throughout our session. Well, not really with slides. Anyway, today's program is brought to you as a collaborative effort between the Great Lakes and Southwest ADA Centers, both members of the ADA National Network. Again, this session is offered as part of the ongoing ADA Legal Webinar Series. Our session today is being recorded, and that recording will be available for review within about 24 hours of the conclusion of the session. A copy of the PowerPoint presentation for today's session was available for download prior to the start of the session. We have posted the link there in the chat area to those handouts. So if you weren't able to download it ahead of time, you still have time to go in and do that. Just look in the chat area there. We've posted the link. We'll also post those later on with the archive file. So again, if you weren't able to access those materials, they will be available via the archive for the session later on, and that link will be posted at www.ada-legal.org/. Again, that'll be within about 24 hours after the conclusion of our session. Our presenter today will provide us with some valuable information and welcomes your questions will be addressed during the conclusion of the presentation. So again, please follow those instructions that Claudia provided earlier. Submit those questions to us in the Q&A box, and feel free to submit them as they come to your mind during the presentation. I'm going to begin today's session by introducing George Powers with our center. For those of you who may not know George, he is an attorney and one of our legal specialists here at the center in Houston. He's been with us, wow, George, about 7 years now, actually maybe going on 8. I feel a little old. He's been providing presentations on a variety of topics, but you might also have talked to George via our toll-free line, as he is an integral part of our team here that provides technical assistance to callers on a daily basis. I always say George is one of my favorite presenters, and it's really true. He's got a great sense of humor, and he really works hard to, encourage our participants to feel at ease and ask questions. So please, again, feel free to ask those in that Q&A box as they come to your mind. Without further ado, to learn a little bit more about George, you can visit the website for today's session, again, at www.ada-legal.org. You can read his full bio there. And again, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you now, George.
Thank you. That was a great intro. Thank you. Right. So Marissa already kind of explained who I am, and also what we're going to be talking about. But I just also wanted to add that I just wanted to add my legal educational background as well. So I graduated from Trinity University and then went on to University of Houston Law Center. And then, yeah, like Marissa said, this past 7-8 years, I've been working in the disability rights field. And I've been mainly focusing on, well, it's an interest, and it's also been my focus professionally, which is a very good privilege, is emerging technologies and accessibility features of those technologies. So I worked like on the transportation accessibility task force here in Houston, and some of my experience is going to come up. Just one moment. I'm sorry. All right, so some of my experiences are going to come up into play. I also just want to emphasize that, you know, these are just kind of my legal opinions, and it's not really meant to be legal advice. It's kind of just meant to be informal guidance. So the big question that we have to answer is why we are here. What we're going to talk about today is it's the 1-year anniversary really of the coronavirus, unfortunately. But we're gonna make things very positive. This presentation is gonna be positive in the sense that we're gonna highlight the access to the digital world that people with disabilities have. So we're going to talk about access to the virtual world. Then we're going to shift slightly into telemedicine. And then finally, we're going to talk about accessible gaming. And I mean, I do encourage people to post the questions in the Q&A. And I think we're going to take questions just intermittently as well, not just at the end. So as I mentioned, this past year has really changed. The coronavirus has shifted the way that we live, the way we work, the way we do everything really. And so as humans, we've had to adapt to the situation, right? And one of the tools that we've used to adapt is technology. And in this past year, we've become much more reliant on technology than we have at any other point, like in our existence, in the existence of civilization. So we're going to look at these technologies from the or these changes in our life from the perspective of the ADA and the 21st century Video and Communication Act. But I'm going to assume that everyone has, you know, somewhat of a background of the ADA. So we're not going to spend too much time on it specifically. But Title I generally deals with, you know, discrimination, protection from discrimination in employment. Title II and Title III require that people with disabilities have equal access to public entities, government services, and public accommodations, respectively. So one of the main ways that life has changed is that a lot of us are going to work through telework. So except for, you know, those first responders and essential workers, those of us that are privileged enough to work from home, we telework, right? Because we have that option. We're that privileged, that fortunate. So telework is just, you know, a form of a reasonable accommodation where you work remotely, you do your job from home. And a big part of that is being in touch or being able to communicate with your coworkers and your supervisors and so on. So to do that, we obviously use technologies like Zoom and our phones, email, and so on. So telework as a reasonable accommodation before the pandemic was kind of not common, I would say. The reasoning is that generally when someone asked for a reasonable accommodation, employers could offer an alternative that was just as effective in the office. So it was very rare to see, telework as a reasonable accommodation before the pandemic. But now, obviously, it's not only a reasonable accommodation, but it's how businesses function, how a lot of corporate America functions, a lot of the service industry, not the service industry, but the communication industry and so on, how they function is through telework. And so what this has done is kind of opened up the gates. Even those without disabilities, right, are using telework as an accommodation or as a means of accessing their job. And so now hopefully we see the light, we see the end of the pandemic coming. And employers have to ask themselves, what are they going to do? They're essentially going to have to close the gates. The gates have opened and they have to close it. And so what they have to do is look at essentially each employee with a disability on a case-by-case basis. And that's how the gates essentially become closed is the EEOC guidance states that, if there's no disability related need that requires teleworking, then the employer doesn't have to accommodate it. So most people right now that are teleworking aren't doing it because of a disability related need. And what's more, before the pandemic, employers could provide alternative accommodations that were just as effective. And if they can, if the workplace now becomes secure, if there's not a threat anymore, a direct threat to people's health and safety, then all those accommodations are probably going to be in the office. Another main thing that has changed in this past year is how employers are recruiting. And employers recruited online before, but now it's come to the point where that's really the only way that employers can recruit. And when employers are doing so, they have to consider all these new barriers in the hiring process, right? They have to consider whether the sites they're posting on, or the social media they're posting on, or whatever other platform they're using is accessible to those that are either blind or deaf or have other disabilities. And a good checklist to do that is can be found at askearn.org. Now, another main way that life has really changed is, employment has changed, obviously, but what we do after work and before work has also changed. So specifically, when we're talking about Title II, we're talking about programs and services that they offer. And this is a term that, has been interpreted broadly to pretty much include everything that a local or state government does. And remember, these governments have an ongoing obligation to make their services and programs accessible. So one thing I know is that, like, public meetings stopped happening, right? They stopped happening physically, where citizen participation became all virtual. All these meetings started happening either on Zoom or other platforms. And so all these new considerations came into play of providing access to people with disabilities, whether it's cognitive or sensory. And then we have just an example of a recent case is in the Alabama school district where it was just a simple issue where the website wasn't inaccessible. Someone filed a complaint, and then the school district fixed it, and that was the end of it. They never even really went to trial. And that case just illustrates that a lot of times these accessibility issues can be fixed really easily or are not that difficult to remedy. And so how do we know like how we make websites and apps and all these kinds of things accessible? There's not an official standard, right? We have accessibility design standards for the physical environment. The 2010 ADA standards is hundreds and hundreds of pages. And so it tells us things like how wide doors have to be, the slope of a ramp, and everything, right? How many accessible parking spaces we need and so on. There's nothing from the government that tells us the same thing about websites, really. So what's happened is when websites or companies that have websites have gotten sued, the major cases were like with Target and Netflix. And so what happens is when these websites get sued, and these companies get sued, they eventually agree to make their platforms, their websites accessible. And to do so, they use these standards called the WCAG standards. And like I said, these are not official. These were just made by a bunch of like developers, website developers, and technology gurus and nerds, pretty much. Sorry, that really smart nerds that know what they're talking about. And the DOJ has pretty much used these website, these WCAG standards in their enforcement efforts. So what happens is the company will say, okay, we'll make our website accessible. How do we do so? And the DOJ will say, you have to adhere to the WCAG 2.0 AA standard, which is, there's different levels. And then WCAG is also coming out with a new version of their standards. I don't think it's in the final draft yet, but WCAG 3.0 is coming out. So another consideration or another thing that's really changed this past year is the way we are entertained, the way we spend our free time. Before the pandemic, people used to like going to the movies. And unfortunately, that's not safe anymore. It has not been safe this past year. So we've used these applications before, but in this past year or two, we've seen like a lot of new applications. We've seen Apple TV Plus, Disney Plus, HBO Max, Peacock, and Paramount Plus, I think just in the last 18 months. And I mean, these websites or these new streaming services are really, I'm trying to keep things positive here, but they're really taking advantage of, an unfortunate situation where people are forced to stay home. So they're providing a service that people want, and they're making a lot of money from it. The aspect there that I'm trying to explain is that these companies are greatly benefiting from the way the economy has shifted because of the pandemic. And so with that, like, rises an obligation to make their services accessible, for other reasons as well, but that's just one reason. I know most of these are pretty accessible. I know HBO Max doesn't have audio description last time I checked. But I mean, the accessibility of these varies, but some of them are far more accessible than others. Now, the law that really applies to these services is the ADA, right? What and it's through case law. But let's go back a bit. The 21st Century Communication and Video Accessibility Act, which I'm going to be referring to as the CVAA. So it was passed in 2010 by the Obama administration, and ironically enough, I mean the reason for it was to close the gap between accessibility laws and technology, right? So technology, is very innovative, and our legislators are not, right? They can't really move fast to accomplish anything. So this law was meant to bridge the gap between these new technologies and the lack of access that the ADA provided at the time. So unfortunately, like it applies to accessibility of video programming like through cable TV, but it does not apply to streaming services like Netflix, Hulu, Amazon Prime, and so on. So what we have to do is go back to the ADA, to Title III, and that's really our only enforcement option for making these services accessible. We've actually done a few webinars on this topic. I mean, it's a complex issue whether they are or are not covered by Title III. It's depends on the jurisdiction you're in. But for the purpose of this webinar, we're gonna assume they are covered by Title III for a number of reasons. I mean, the main one being that they're occupying that market space that movie theaters used to occupy in the past. So another place, another common, resurgence. Driving theaters had a resurgence this past year. People missed going to the cinema, so instead they started going to the drive-in theater because that's safe. You can socially distance. Unfortunately, drive-in theaters don't have the same like captioning and audio description requirements that that movie theaters in general do. So if you're a person that needs those features to access to see a movie, essentially, you can't go to a drive-in theater, unfortunately. And that's just the way the law is written. It's just exempt from Title III. Part of it is because of technological requirements, analog versus digital. But I do know there are accessible drive-in theaters throughout the country. And then another big way that life has changed this past year is how we eat. And so a lot of us have become dependent on takeout or our grocery delivery or even curbside. We still have the option to go and go in the store and socially distance, but I mean, these are the options that most people use, and there's been a huge uptick in these apps. And for the most part, these applications are accessible, and they are covered by Title III. I mean, again, there's a different webinar on this subject where it depends on the jurisdiction and so on. But most of these apps are accessible. Some issues that have come up are where like drivers fail to make drivers or delivery personnel fail to make reasonable accommodations, um, um, like um, like delivering something, you know, to a specific, like versus a door to a specific, like to a different location, like a patio or something like that. Some simple stuff that's just mostly due to miscommunications. And so next we're gonna stay with Title III and move on to the doctor's office, but I think this is a good place to take a few questions. Marissa?
Great. Thanks, George. Yes. So one of the first questions was touching on, uh, it says, a concern that some legal departments have in the use of certain remote platforms, such as Zoom, texting, or FaceTime, could easily result in personal health information violations, as well as FOIA, Freedom of Information Act. How should this be addressed?
Yeah, I mean, so if we're talking about HIPAA, that's a bit, we're going to be talking about that a bit about when we talk about telemedicine, but I mean, it depends on the legal departments, like what the role of the company is. If we're talking about healthcare providers, it's way more complex than this webinar can provide, but you have to do, I mean, essentially a lot more research. And the thing is, a lot of these regulations have become lax, which is what we're going to be talking about. Um, um, I don't think I really answered that question, but um,
Are we
I
going to
mean,
be getting to it a little bit later?
yeah.
Okay. Next question is, does a public entity that holds open public meetings on a virtual platform need to provide closed captioning and or a sign interpreter as part of the broadcast?
Okay. That's a good question. So this depends. If we're talking about a public meeting, so if it's a Title II meeting, then yeah. If it's anything held by a local or a state government or a county government, yeah, there should be an assumption that someone, part of your city, there's a disability related need for your citizens to attend. Yeah. If it's a private entity, then you you have your expectation is a bit different, and so you essentially ask ahead of time if anybody needs those accommodations. Does that make sense?
Okay. Another question we had was in reference to something you mentioned early on. I believe you mentioned a checklist when you were talking about employment. Can you clarify for us? I think you had mentioned where it was available. Was it?
Yeah.
Uh, Go
At
ahead.
askearn.org,
Okay.
they have a checklist to make sure, like if you're recruiting online, they have a checklist to make sure that your methods are accessible or are not discriminatory.
Great. Putting that in the chat area right now. Um, I think at this time we don't have any other questions.
Okay, good. So the other way, the other major thing that's really changed this past year is the like the emergence of telemedicine, right? Only, especially early on in the pandemic, most of us didn't have access to healthcare in the physical sense unless we had a dire emergency. So if we're talking about like doctor visits, psychiatric visits, therapy visits, and so on, telemedicine has really taken off this past year. And back in 2017, we actually wrote about telemedicine, and we looked at like all the benefits it had. Like there were all these studies that talked about um, these, like when hospitals implemented telemedicine into their healthcare services, they saw that they had both improved clinical as well as economic outcomes. Um, Another really good benefit to telemedicine that we saw was that rural areas generally don't have access to healthcare, and that becomes even more true when we're talking about specialist health, like specialized healthcare. So um, telemedicine, like um, the study was for providing psychological or psychiatric services to those in rural areas, and obviously, you know, doing it through telemedicine was a great success. Um, and then it was also like beneficial from the healthcare providers, in the sense that they can provide their services on demand, right? And so they don't have to worry about the physical barriers and the transportation costs that the consumer has. The consumer doesn't have to worry about those things as much. And from the uh, um, and in the past, I mean, not in the past administration, but in the Obama administration, there was a great emphasis on preventive healthcare, and like the use of telemedicine, obviously, you know, promoted preventive healthcare. I mean, it's kind of common sense, right? You're more likely when you don't feel well or you need, you know, you need something from a healthcare provider, you're more likely to like do it on your iPad than get in your car and drive to the doctor's office and so on. So all these benefits, this was way before even the pandemic. I mean, were apparent through telemedicine. Um, but there were just barriers in general. So obviously, telemedicine is very dependent on a good internet connection. And so those with lower incomes don't have the same access, you know, to those greater internet, that broadband internet service. And a lot of it, it's not just economical, like it's also based on infrastructure, right? These the communities that are in the lower economic, you know, aren't as privileged, I guess, is the way I'm saying it. Their broadband infrastructure in those communities is not as well set up. So even if there is a consumer in that community that wants, you know, that has the ability to pay for good internet services, it might not even be an option for them. And so a lot of people with disabilities, unfortunately, are on the, you know, lower end of the income spectrum. So these issues, I mean, it's a great tool to help those with disabilities, but also it's, if we can't get it to them, it's an issue, right? It's a problem. And then even though it's great for rural areas, the problem again is that the infrastructure needs to be updated in those areas so that people have good internet access. And before the pandemic, there were a lot of regulatory barriers. Um, Insurances didn't cover it all the time. For example, a lot of these laws, a lot of medical um, medical practice-based laws are state laws. So there were a lot of state regulations that got in the way. And then there was a huge concern over being able to prescribe medications through telemedicine or telehealth. Obviously, all these regulatory barriers have been wiped away this past year. so that people can have access to medicine. We've been forced to do it. Essentially, we've been forced to cut through all the red tape. So there's all these benefits that telemedicine can provide to those with disabilities, right? Like they don't have to worry about the physical barriers and so on, or transportation issues. The problem is we have to make sure that the telemedicine itself or the telehealth platform is accessible or open to access, right? And so these are essentially the accessible elements that we're looking for, whether the application can be used with a screen reader, magnification, high contrast software. And then for like actual medical appointments, the duty to provide an ASL interpreter doesn't necessarily go away. You still have to provide effective communication. That may look different. It may look like captioning. I don't know. It depends on the consumer. It's still a very case-by-case basis when you're talking about providing healthcare to an individual. The important part to remember is that if you're a healthcare provider and you have an app and the app tells you we're accessible, your obligation doesn't stop there. If for some reason the app is not accessible, you can still be held liable. Let's see. So a lot of these issues are almost on a state level, like in the sense that all of these regulatory issues are on a state level, in the sense that states have generally, been the ones that govern medical practice within their borders. So with telemedicine, this has kind of changed things because you can see a doctor in another state, right? If you have like through telemedicine, that's possible now. So there's all these regulatory issues that have come up, and so a lot of this has been cut away this past year, just because out of necessity. Another key aspect, just another example of how we've been able to cut through the red tape essentially is now, if a person needs to take FMLA leave, family and medical leave, they can just use telemedicine as an in-person visit. So that, anyone that's dealt with FMLA issues before knows how kind of like specific the regulations were about following the paperwork and so on. And so for the Department of Labor to have something like this where it makes life more reasonable and accessible for people, it's a success. And so I think we had a few questions about telemedicine, and why don't we answer those before we move on to the next issue?
Okay, great. Let's see here. So in terms of telemedicine, does this information also apply to student health services on college campuses?
Yeah, of course. If you're providing healthcare services, yes. So I'm assuming it's like the clinic at the school providing healthcare services.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then again, another question is, the problem is that many rural areas in America still do not have adequate access to quality broadband service. Could you please explain what a Title II entity's responsibility is, if any, to bring this service to its citizens under the ADA?
As I mean, that's a that's a novel argument, and and I like it. I don't think you would get very far with it, because you'd almost have to show that the reason they're not providing broadband in those rural areas is because of disabilities, right? Is because there's a community of people with disabilities there. Um, if you're trying to say ask for it as a reasonable accommodation, then the Title II entity would probably say it's a fundamental alteration or an undue hardship.
Okay. All right. I'm not seeing any others again. Do you want to go back to that other previous question about the legal departments?
Sure. Do you mind repeating it, please?
Sure, sure. So, a concern that some legal departments have is that the use of certain remote platforms, such as Zoom or FaceTime or texting, could easily result in personal health information violations, as well as Freedom of Information Act. So, how should this be addressed?
All right. Well, so if we're talking about freedom of information stuff, we're talking about like government communications between government officials. If we're talking about healthcare information, right, we're talking about information between healthcare providers about um, their um, their consumers. So, I mean, as a healthcare, so we're going to split those two up. As a healthcare provider, you should not disclose any of that information in general, whether it's virtually or in person, like texting and stuff like that. It's not safe. I see the point. It's not safe. You have to do it through secure communications when we're talking about confidential healthcare information. For FOIA concerns, that the government, any I don't know too much about it, but essentially it's like any communications between government officials, public has access to it. And so that's a different issue than I would say the ADA covers. And so I don't think I would advise one way or the other.
Yeah, I was going to say, George, if the individual wants to clarify a little bit more about their question,
Yeah.
because it's a little confusing there. So if you want to clarify for us in that Q&A box, we'll try to revisit it later on if we can. And let's see here.
Okay.
All right. Well, with respect to that, to the telemedicine, I'm not seeing any other questions at this time.
Okay. So thank you. So now we're gonna talk. So the second half of the webinar is going to be about accessible gaming. And so this is, I think, another way that life has changed in this past year. But I mean, we've seen we've seen gaming become a more significant part of our society even before then. But since we found ourselves cooped up in our houses this past year, a lot of us have started gaming or have gamed more than we did before. And so we're gonna kind of talk about the accessible aspects of gaming and how the law applies to it. And I think we're going to see a lot of positives in this upcoming segment. So for this portion, I'm going to be talking about really the main players, which are Xbox, PlayStation, Nintendo, PC, but I don't think we're not going to cover mobile games, and we're not going to cover virtual reality. So why should we care about accessible gaming as just in general? There's a lot of social and rehabilitative benefits. We actually looked at this a few years ago as well. For example, like surgeons use those surgeons that gamed regularly. It was found that they had like much better dexterity than those surgeons that didn't game regularly. There were also like all these studies that talked about like the cognitive, and there's all these rehabilitative benefits too. But it's just a part of our society, and I think it, like in the past year, it was around 40 billion a year business industry. So that doesn't mean that gaming itself is good, but I think that we can use it. We can use how much a part of our economy it is to measure how significant it is to our society or our life. For example, companies like Amazon. I mean, these are not gaming companies, but Amazon, Google, and Apple, and companies and Microsoft, I think they own close to like 20% of our economy's share, and that shouldn't be surprising because I use Google every day, I use Amazon almost every day, and so on. And so, so this brings me to further to this point about why should we care about accessible gaming. I mean, I think there are a lot of benefits to gaming for those with and without disabilities. Two, it's part of our society. And three, I mean, even if it was not, like if gaming was not beneficial, like if it was not really that great, we should still care about access to it. So I talked about the 2010 ADA standards before, and the design standards, like we have all these specifications about how wide doors have to be and so on. And so the thing is, these specifications don't tell us which parts of society have to be accessible and don't have to be, right? We make libraries accessible, or we make libraries just as accessible as we make liquor stores, you know, and arguably one is more valuable than the other. So as those that put into place accessible elements or accessible standards, it's not their role to kind of decide what should be accessible or what should not be accessible, like what part of society is valuable enough to be accessible versus what part of society is not. So to kind of illustrate a point, I'm gonna highlight this video game. It's called The Surge, and there's a few reasons I want to highlight it. One is because it's from a small developer, and I really liked that they used or they had a representation of a person with a disability. So this is what the game is most of the time. It's you chopping up people essentially as this really badass mech suited guy. But in the first 20, 30 minutes, you're this man, this individual who's a wheelchair user, and you come onto this facility and to become this mechanical badass. And so what I want to illustrate or show some screenshots because I think this game gets some things very right in representation, but also doesn't get some things that right or that correctly. So in the first 30 minutes, you're this wheelchair user and you're exploring the environment, and the environment is generally accessible. Like, for example, there's wheelchair spaces for people. But then you come to these stairs, and what you notice is that there's no ramp on the side, or there's no alternative way to go up there. So what the developers essentially did is use barriers, like use stairs as invisible walls, to cut off where players can and cannot go. And so instead, they made areas where you can go accessible. And this is, I saw what the designers were, or the developers were trying to do. They were trying to make accessibility a part of the game. But what they essentially did was what I was trying to talk about earlier, which is as when we're applying accessible standards, it's not our it's not their responsibility, or it's not our role to determine what has the value of being accessible and not. So if, for example, I mean, this game kind of illustrates if, for example, the 2010 ADA standards were designed in a way to where, certain areas where barriers were put up in place so that people with disabilities just couldn't access them. Another good part or another highlight of that developer was that they actually had a lot of accessibility settings in their game. And so when we're talking about accessible gaming, what we're really talking about is universal design. We're talking about making something that is as accessible to as many people as possible. And this is another game, Borderlands 3, and I wanted to highlight this game. This, unlike The Surge, it's a very popular game, and it's it's one of those multi-million-dollar selling games. But this game had all the accessibility settings that I think should be the kind of the base, or should it's a good example of some great accessibility settings. For one, they have all kinds of video options, like to change the size of the user interface and so on. And like the screenshot shows, there's an option to change to turn on closed captioning. So you have the option for subtitles where you can hear what the other players or the other NPCs, the non-playable characters in the game say, but you also have the option to hear like critical sound effects, or to have those through closed captions. And then obviously the accessibility feature that those with mobility issues care about is like custom button mapping. So I'm just going to just kind of review some of these features just so that we understand what accessible gaming is. Essentially, it's designing a game in a way that is as accessible to as many people as possible. And for people with disabilities, it means having a base setting for accessibility features. So some things you can do are kind of the same things that we do for like websites and streaming applications. Things like having subtitles, closed captioning. Another good feature is like changing the size of text. And then for those, like I mentioned, those with mobility disabilities have other issues. We're gonna kind of go through each platform and see, kind of compare and see what is and is not accessible within each platform. So the main players, like I said before, are Microsoft, which is the Xbox console systems, Sony, the PlayStation systems, and the Nintendo Switch. Nintendo Switch is the other one. Valve is the main gaming platform for PC players. And what's interesting about these is that they're not just consoles now. Like back in the day, you just put in a cartridge in a system and the game would boot up. But now they've created all these ecosystems and social aspects to these games and the consoles themselves as well. So, for example, Xbox talks about how they want their platform to be an ecosystem, right? And so I think that that's going to become significant in the upcoming slides. The people that really make games accessible are the developers. We have like companies like Microsoft and Sony, but it's really like the nerds, right? That I was talking about earlier. These really smart individuals that know how to do program and so on. And so these game developers are really the ones that we have to get to, or that are really responsible for making the product accessible. Okay. So like I mentioned, back in the day, you just put a cartridge in your Nintendo Entertainment System and it would boot up, and that was the game. Now there's two levels, right? There's like, for example, there's a network. There's an Xbox Live network, a PlayStation network. Your console just isn't for playing games, and it's specifically designed for that. It's designed to be a media device, right? A media and social device, and because of that, all these new accessibility issues come up. So the best way to kind of understand this stuff is just to go through it. And the first major console is the Xbox. And so in it, there's an operating system that kind of mirrors Windows 10. It was specifically designed to do that as well. But the good thing is that the current generation of consoles have these accessibility settings. So for example, in the Xbox, on the Xbox, it allows for custom button mapping on the through the Xbox software itself. However, one downside is that to do so, to have full customization, you need something that's called an Elite controller, which is much more expensive than the generic Xbox controller. Microsoft has also implemented mouse and keyboard support. So one concept of accessibility that we find in that's important in the digital world is openness. I'm not going to say things are open source because they're not, but developers can make their platforms more open, and this is one example of it where Microsoft is allowing other inputs into their console, and then just some other settings that the Xbox have are about the narrator. I mean, these the high contrast, the magnifier, and the closed caption, and these just mirror the settings that you really find in Windows 10. Another great thing that Microsoft did this past, I think it was about 2 years ago, was that they released the adaptive controller. And I think it cost about $100. And what it allows you to do is that those with mobility issues can control a number of different devices and switches to the Xbox adaptive controller and game the way they need to. And so this is, again, going back to the concept of openness. This is like where Microsoft was able to develop a product that allowed other products to be integrated within it. So Sony is the other main. The PlayStation 5 is the other main console right now, and it has accessibility settings that really mirror the Xboxes. It does not have an adaptive controller. Sony does not have an adaptive controller. You cannot use the Xbox's adaptive controller not officially. And but generally, as about closed captioning and magnification and screen reader stuff, it has about the same level of access. The Nintendo Switch is the other main console or major console, and unfortunately, it has no accessibility settings at all for the operating system. There was an update earlier this or last year where that allowed for button remapping for some of its controllers, but the console itself is just can just be inaccessible because of its design. And to really understand it, I recommend you go to the Able Gamers website, and they kind of explain it. But to make it accessible, essentially, there's no official ways. There's third-party controllers and so on, which is sad because the picture on the right, the NES hands-free controller, that was a product that Nintendo made back in the late 80s or early 90s for its Nintendo Entertainment System. So even back then, they knew how important accessibility they knew what accessible gaming was. And so it's kind of sad to see that now, back then it was hard to get those controllers. It's really hard it's actually like a valuable item now. But it's kind of sad to see that back then they had an official accessible controller, even though it might not have been that good. But now to access their console, you have to go through third-party or unofficial routes. And then now we're gonna, the other major gaming platform is obviously PC or personal computers. And the main, so the good thing about the PC is that it is very open. It's very customizable by the user. But the main platform that PC users use for gaming is called Steam. It's a client owned by a company called Valve. It's essentially just a web-based software client, and it's where you buy your games, where you download your games. It's where you have it. It's the same. It's essentially the same experience that you would experience on Xbox Live or the PlayStation Network. And the way it originally came into popularity was that about 20 years ago, developers were really concerned about piracy on the PC platform. So this client was used to kind of cure those concerns. So there's a lot of good and a lot of bad about PC gaming when it comes to access for those with disabilities. One good thing is it's open. So, if you have your screen reader software on Windows 10, you have your magnification software on Windows 10 and so on. And so you would assume that those would be usable on this application. And sometimes they can be, but not really. There's no official access. On Mac, there's no access at all. It's just the way the like the program is coded to like take priority, which is unfortunate, right? And so the same thing on issue. We have the same issue on Windows. There's only partial access for screen readers like NVDA or JAWS. And there's just a lot of design issues that go against the WCAG principles, like the color palettes or the ability to navigate with a keyboard and so on. So the client itself is not very accessible. However, Valve, I want to say about 8 years ago, they wanted to compete with the console market, so they started releasing these things called the Steam boxes, which were just essentially small PCs in a small box. That's what they were. But they ran on this operating system, semi-operating system, I want to say, that Steam used at the time, called the Big Picture mode. So this mode, this semi-operating system, was developed to kind of attract console gamers to the PC market. And what it wound up doing unintentionally is it brought a lot of accessibility features to the platform. Not we still have the screen reader and the other barriers, like the sensory barriers on the platform, but for those with mobility issues, there's a lot more customization options. Now, I think some people might think that it's strange that I'm talking about like screen reader software for gaming, but there are actually games on the Steam store itself made for people who are blind. And then the other point is there are people who are blind that play games. And then another thing is there's people with just bad vision or low vision, and they may be able to play, but the barrier that they are facing is the client. So like I said, we're gonna keep this positive, and I think there's a lot to be happy about, because these networks, these social ecosystems that came up, like the Xbox network, Xbox Live network, and the PlayStation network, they came into play really about 8 years ago or 10 years ago, with the original PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. And so in that generation, so that was 3 generations ago, and in that generation, there were no accessibility settings. And then in the next generation, which was Xbox One, and then the PlayStation 4, we saw accessibility settings that are very similar to the ones we have today. So I think a lot of these settings were in response to the law, but I also think there's another part of it. But to understand the law, so the law that applies is the 21st CVAA. It doesn't really require games for them to be accessible, but the language in the regulation requires advanced communication services to be accessible. And so and that just means like any type of messaging, any type of communication that we do online. And there was a waiver from this law that expired in 2019. So until 2019, the entertainment software industry, the video gaming industry, didn't have to really follow this law, but most of those platforms were still accessible. So even though the games themselves don't have to be accessible right under the 21st CVAA, there's still like the games themselves have changed so much that they're not just a game anymore, right? They have all these social aspects to them, and so there's all these new legal concerns that come up, right? There's all these blurred lines. For example, we look at games like GTA 5 or Marvel's Avengers, The Division, and Destiny 2. These are all games designed not to just be games. They're designed to be social services, right? They're designed for the consumer to be on there for years and years, right? GTA 5 came out 3 generations ago on the PlayStation 3, and GTA 5 Online, is still coming up with new content. It has a healthy user base. So there's this, games aren't games anymore, right? Is what I'm saying, is that these lines have become blurred, and because they have all these new legal concerns have come up. Another example is like GameStop has been in the news recently, right? Obviously, they're in trouble economically in the sense that a lot of the business that was done in that store is now done on digital stores, right? Xbox, Steam, Sony, PlayStation, they all have their own virtual stores. So we have requirements that say that GameStop in its physical structure has to be accessible. And so now we're just applying those same principles to the virtual stores that have come up, or the new social digital ecosystems that have been created. And like, I want to just kind of reiterate that it's not kind of a coincidence that this has all happened, right? These games and these consoles were all designed with this purpose. They were designed to have this social the social media based product or service. So I think that the entertainment software industry has been pretty responsive for as far as making their their products and services accessible. And there's been a few reasons for it. Like I said, the CVAA, I think, was one reason. But I really think it's just more of a understanding of accessibility needs, right? I think that a lot of developers have embraced universal design, and they've kind of had to, in kind of the time that we live, like 30 years ago, we didn't have access to things like Twitter and stuff, right, and Facebook. So now a lot of developers are on social media, so they have direct interaction with the consumers that they're creating the product or the game for. And part of that is interacting with those with disabilities. And I know for a fact, I know of several games that have actually been patched after release to add accessibility features because consumers or gamers have requested it. So developers are much more accountable than, I would say, like an architect, for a number of reasons, but one, because they have to be. And then the entertainment software industry itself, it's self-serving. Like we saw this when there were efforts to put in censorship into games. And so what we saw, like early in the 90s, there were all these legislative efforts to censor games. And so what we saw was that entertainment software industry kind of just took over and governed themselves and started, starting marking games, 17 and under or 11 and under. And they started rating games themselves. They started governing themselves to keep the government out. And I think this is kind of what they're doing, honestly, and what they have been doing is that they want to avoid regulation. So they're not even allowing for like these issues to come up, right? They're as soon as an accessibility issue comes up, most developers respond. And this has just kind of been the nature of the entertainment industry in general. And then I just kind of wanted to mention crossplay access. So what this means is, even though that like a console like the Nintendo Switch is not accessible, there's still things that they can do to kind of allow access to their ecosystem. And this is the concept of crossplay, where essentially an Xbox or a PlayStation player can play with someone on the Nintendo Switch, right? We saw this with Fortnite, which is semi-popular game, I guess. But yeah, this was not an accessibility issue, but it kind of illustrates how they can how they can interrelate, right? So what we saw was that Fortnite, if you were an Xbox player, you could only play with other Xbox player. If you were a PlayStation player, you could play with other PlayStation players only. But we saw that Microsoft opened up and allowed themselves to be crossplay, allowed other platforms, PC mainly, I think. So, and then eventually PlayStation opened up, and so now you can access the same virtual world through different consoles, whichever one is more accessible for you. And really, I think that's all I have. And I want to say thank you for listening, for those that did. And if we have any more questions, I'll take some.
We do. We do. Thank you, George. We do have a few questions here, so let me get to it. One question is, they're curious to hear your thoughts on like virtual reality for educational purposes. For instance, like in medical education, there are applications to explore, organ systems. Do you have any thoughts on that? Or is that maybe something for another webinar?
Yeah, I don't think that's really an access issue. But I do know that like the virtual reality platform also has gained a lot of accessibility settings in this last generation. I mean, that's not really related to the, that's not a question I can answer, I'm sorry.
Okay. This question is with regards to the accessible controller that you mentioned. It says, how many custom button options are required by the ADA, if any?
None. That's what I'm saying. We have all these standards that talk about how our environment has to be accessible, but we don't have the same kind of standards about we don't have the same official standards for the virtual world. And I don't think that and to be really accessible, it has to be fully customizable, but there's nothing in the law that says that. I mean, there's nothing in the law that says 12 out of 12 buttons have to be accessible.
Okay, and then actually kind of building on that, this next question also has to do with accessible controllers. Could it be argued that charging more for an accessible controller discriminates against users with mobility impairments? It's a great question.
Yeah, and I think that's an issue that Xbox has, not with the adaptive controller, because The adaptive controller is just an extra controller essentially. But I think Xbox has an issue with its so there's two kinds of controllers you can buy for it. One costs $60 and the other is costs $160. And so to be fully customizable, you have to buy the $160 one. In this, and that's a software limitation that they have in their operating system. It's just a purely software limitation they have in their operating system.
Okay. And then another question is regarding when you talked about Nintendo earlier, they're asking, why do you think Nintendo is not quite up to speed?
That's a really good question. So Nintendo has always been kind of stubborn. It's been uh, the corporate culture, for better or worse. But I think part of it is that Sony and Microsoft have had these social networks like the Xbox Live Network and the PlayStation Network for two generations, and this is the third generation now. And so Nintendo only released you know, their equivalent to this network a couple of years ago. So to sum up, it's mainly because their console is more traditional in the sense that it doesn't have these social and these media aspects that these other consoles have.
Okay. And then we have, okay, so we've got a little commentary with regard to an earlier question about the adaptable controllers. They're saying, fully accessible. Thank you, Rebecca. Fully accessible and or adaptable controllers may cost more to manufacture, and the consumer can be expected to pay the increased cost, which would not necessarily be discriminatory.
Right, and that's what I'm saying. The adaptive controller, right? That one that costs $100, that's understandable. But they have like a software paywall also in their accessibility settings. That I mean, you could say it's not a big deal, but it it kind of with if you buy the $60 controller, and they're pretty much the same controller, but if you buy the $60 controller, you have like 90% accessibility options. But if you buy 100 and the $160 elite controller, which is not the adaptive controller, then you have 100% accessible features. So that's a different issue than a different like an adaptive controller in itself.
Okay, thank you, George. This next question it goes back to the virtual reality. They're curious, what are your thoughts on the new Oculus VRCs and for accessible gaming?
So it depends on I think it can have a lot of benefits for it depends on what your disability is, right? If you have like a vision-based disability, I think virtual reality is probably a very good option, but it also depends on the game. And I mean, it's just hard to say. Uh, there's all these mobility issues also that virtual reality, just the way it's designed, brings up, right? If you have limited mobility of your limbs, so that could be an issue too. It's all very personal, but there are just some basic settings in the VR apps. I know PSVR, I know at least has some.
Okay, this goes back to when you talked, we're switching gears a little bit here for a couple minutes. This kind of goes back to some of your earlier slides where you talked about local government and public meetings. This person is asking, when emergency order for virtual public meetings ends, since local governments have now proven, the need for virtual access. Will states, allowing for in-person meetings, does this mean that city governments can now then stop providing live streaming and closed captioning of those meetings?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, they if they just want to if they want to stop live streaming, yes, they can. If they want to just only hold the meetings in person. However, there could be some kind of reasonable accommodation you could ask for as an individual to attend the meeting through Zoom or some application like that. If you can't leave, if you can't travel or you can't leave the house because of your disability, then yeah.
Okay. And then we're going back to, the clarification of an earlier question. We said we would come back to it, and thank you for clarifying. So they're saying, with respect to the telehealth, one issue is the agency that deals with confidential information refuses to allow accessible platforms because of security concerns. And as an example, they're mentioning Zoom is very accessible. But the agency says Zoom cannot be used because, according to them, it would violate the confidentiality that is required by HIPAA. And the same thing is being said about texting. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think just texting over um, so is this between a consumer and their healthcare provider?
Let's assume it is.
Okay.
How about that?
Okay. So yeah, if it's we have to look at the regulations, right? So I think for Zoom, the way you cure the HIPAA concern is by having a password on it. I know that's how you cure the confidentiality concern for like legal like consultations with your lawyer. So I would assume you have a similar way to cure it. That being said, like the Department of Health has made it very easy to use these apps. So I'm not sure exactly what your provider, what their issue is. As far as texting, I can see why some providers would not want to text personal health information. But if you are a person and that's a person who is deaf and that's the only way you can communicate, then it may be reasonable. Yeah,
Yeah,
you kind of have to see the duty is to communicate effectively. I mean, are those the only two ways we can communicate? There are secure apps, is what I'm saying. There's a secure ways to communicate digitally.
yeah, George, if I may add a little bit to your conversation, I've had some experience with this as I have some elderly parents who live with me, and I've had, in the past year, I've had some experience with this. The only thing I can say is it really depends on the provider, but also you have to keep in mind too that, as reasonable accommodation requests come in, and they'll need to be handled on an individual basis, that means they have to go and look at that when the request comes in for something like this, then it may be that they need to modify their policy. Right, George?
Right, correct.
And that would be, it's not necessarily a workaround. Some providers will work with an agency. It just depends. Like I said, there's so many different providers out there, but some of them may work with an agency to use a particular application. And then from that though, there's also a whole other issue of going back to your accessibility and your effective communication. So I know as an example, I can say that my elderly mother we were using an application to communicate back and forth. It's very similar to like Zoom or even FaceTime, but it was very, on their end, on the provider's end, it was very limited in terms of the bandwidth. So we were having a very hard time communicating back and forth. Um, so what the doctor did as a workaround, okay, was they called us back and they asked for consent to be able to use FaceTime. Again, it's a workaround. It's not something it's not a one-stop solution. And I will end that there. George, I don't know if you have anything else you would like to add.
No. Yeah. The privacy issues are a bit different than the accessibility issues. And yeah, you definitely covered that well. Thank you.
Thanks. And another comment here, this is a great comment that we've just received is, as a medical interpreter, we were required to have a password on our phones. We needed patient names for our appointments. So there you go, again.
Yeah, and that's what I mean. Like, I think when we first initially started using Zoom, like a year ago for healthcare services and stuff, that didn't come up. But somewhere in there, Department of Human Services, some regulations sent out an email saying you should use passwords and stuff. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we are literally at time. George, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. I'm going to go ahead and conclude today's webinar. We had great comments and great questions from everybody. We realize you may still have questions for George, so we apologize if you did not get a chance to ask that. You can always feel free to email us your questions and we'll make sure it gets to him at the Southwest ADA Center, and you can send your email to swdbtac@ilru.org, and we will provide an answer. I'll put that in the chat area in just a second. I want to thank our presenter, George Powers, for sharing his expertise. This is a great topic. I know probably we could have gone on for a lot longer. It branches out into several other really cool and interesting topics today. Anyway, as a last reminder, today's session was recorded and it will be available for viewing within 24 hours. And that will be up at www.ada-legal.org. Again, that'll be in the archive section within about 24 hours. And finally, we invite you to join us for the next ADA legal webinar series on May 15th as we discuss the topic to be determined. So registration will be available soon for that. And again, to go register for that, you can go to www.ada-legal.org. So mark your calendars for that date. For questions regarding this or other sessions in the series, you can direct those to by calling 877-232-1990 or via email to webinars@adaconferences.org. Lastly, you will receive a link to the evaluation via email at the conclusion of today's program, as well as instructions regarding securing your certificates of attendance and your ACT-CP accreditation. So we encourage you to participate and share your views with us via the evaluation there, as those are always valued. Again, thank you to George, thank you to Claudia and the staff at the Great Lakes Center. for all of your wonderful program presentation today. Again, thank you. You may now disconnect by closing your browser.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon.